Ruthless bikers surround a helpless old man. What he reveals freezes them in place. The old man pushed open the creaky door of the diner, the faint jingle of the bell above his head almost drowned out by the distant roar of engines. His heavy boots scraped against the uneven pavement as he stepped outside, adjusting the collar of his worn leather jacket against the cool breeze. The street was quiet, too quiet. Shadows stretched long in the fading light of the evening, and the town's usual chatter had vanished, replaced by an unnerving silence. He glanced down the road, his hand tightening on the cane he carried, not for support but as a silent companion to his determined stride. The rumble grew louder. At first, it was distant, like a storm brewing on the horizon. But soon, the sound became unmistakable. The deep, throaty growl of motorcycles echoed through the narrow streets, bouncing off the faded brick buildings. The old man stopped mid-stride, his eyes narrowing. He didn't flinch, though his heart thudded like a drum in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, yet preparing for it all the same. And then they appeared. The gang came into view like a swarm of crows descending on their prey. A dozen bikes roared in unison as the riders weaved down the street, their leather jackets gleaming under the amber streetlights. Emblazoned on their backs was a single emblem, a grinning skull with the words "Iron Shadows" scrawled in jagged letters beneath it. They were infamous, a name whispered in hushed tones around these parts, but the old man didn't look away. He couldn't afford to. The bikes slowed to a crawl as they approached him, surrounding him like a pack of wolves circling their prey. Tires screeched as the riders dismounted, their heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Their leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jawline, was the first to speak. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying an edge that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. If it isn't the man of the hour. The old man stood his ground, his face a mask of calm. He tilted his head slightly, meeting the leader's gaze with eyes that had seen far worse than the likes of him. "I don't recall inviting company," he said, his voice steady but low, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. The gang laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed through the street. "You've got some nerve, old man," another biker sneered, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "You think you can just walk around here without answering for what you've done?" "I don't owe you an explanation," the old man replied. His grip tightened on the cane, though he made no move to use it. He didn't need to, not yet. The leader stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel as he closed the distance between them. "No explanation, huh? That's funny," he said, leaning in until their faces were inches apart. "Because last I checked, you've got a pretty big debt to settle." The old man didn't blink. "You're wasting your time." The leader's expression darkened. He turned to his men, spreading his arms wide. "You hear that, boys? Wasting our time. He thinks we came all this way for a friendly chat." His voice was laced with mockery, but there was an undercurrent of anger that couldn't be ignored. The bikers closed in, their movements predatory. One of them reached out and grabbed the old man's shoulder, his grip rough and unyielding. "You don't get to brush us off," the biker growled. "Not after what you did." The old man's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't one of amusement, it was something colder, something that hinted at the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "Careful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You might regret that." The biker's grip faltered for a moment, but he tightened it again, his pride unwilling to let him back down. The leader raised a hand, signaling for the gang to step back. "Let's give him a chance to explain himself," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "After all, we're reasonable men." The old man let out a dry laugh. "Reasonable? Is that what you call this?" "You've got two choices," the leader continued, ignoring the sarcasm. "You can tell us what we want to know, or we can make you talk. Either way, you're not walking out of here without paying your dues." The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every second stretch into an eternity. The old man's gaze swept over the gang, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, the way their hands hovered near their weapons, the nervous energy in their stances. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how it would end if they made the first move. "I'm not afraid of you," he said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. And if you knew what was good for you, you'd walk away right now. The leader's scarred face twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Brave words for a man with one foot in the grave. But I think you're bluffing. The old man shook his head, the faint smile still lingering on his lips. You think you know everything, don't you? You think you've got the upper hand? He paused, letting his words sink in. But you have no idea who I am? For a moment, the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The confidence they had shown moments ago was beginning to crack, replaced by something they didn't fully understand. The leader, however, wasn't ready to back down. He grabbed the old man's cane, yanking it out of his hand and tossing it to the ground. Then why don't you enlighten us? He demanded. Who are you, old man? The old man stared at the leader, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch. And then, finally, he spoke. I'm the one who buried your past, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the gang. And I'm the one who can dig it up again. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as the full meaning of the old man's statement began to sink in. For the first time, the leader's confident facade faltered. He took a step back, his scarred face paling. What are you talking about? He asked, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held before. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he bent down slowly, picking up his cane and dusting it off as if nothing had happened. When he straightened, he met the leader's gaze once more, his eyes cold and unrelenting. You'll find out soon enough, he said. But trust me when I tell you this, you're not ready for the truth. The old man's words sent a ripple of unease through the group. The leader, who moments ago seemed in total control, now hesitated, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and doubt. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another as if looking for reassurance. But none of them spoke. None of them dared. What's he talking about, Rook? One of the younger bikers finally asked, his voice trembling. His eyes darted between the old man and their leader, searching for answers. What past? The leader, Rook, turned to glare at the younger man, his face hardening. Shut your mouth, Tyler, he snapped. Don't let him get in your head. But the cracks in Rook's composure were showing, and the old man wasn't about to let them go unnoticed. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each movement. The sound was almost hypnotic, drawing the gang's attention back to him like moths to a flame. You've done a lot to bury the truth, the old man said, his voice calm but unyielding. But no matter how deep you dig, some things don't stay buried. Enough of this cryptic nonsense, another biker growled, stepping forward with a sneer. He was broad-shouldered and burly, his leather jacket stretched tight across his chest. You think you can scare us with a bunch of riddles, old man? You're just buying time. The old man turned his gaze to the burly biker, his expression devoid of fear. And what are you afraid of? He asked softly, his tone almost conversational. That I might know the truth about you too? The biker faltered, his bravado slipping for just a moment. But he quickly recovered, scowling as he reached for the knife tucked into his belt. You've got a big mouth for someone who doesn't know when to shut it. Stop, Rook commanded, his voice sharp. The burly biker froze, his hand hovering over the knife's hilt. Rook stepped forward, placing himself between the old man and his men. His eyes were locked on the old man, and for the first time, there was no trace of mockery or amusement in his expression. You've got guts, I'll give you that, Rook said, his tone low and measured. But if you think you can walk away from this without answering for what you've done, you're dead wrong. The old man tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. And what is it, exactly, that you think I've done? Rook's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You know what this is about, he said. You think you're clever playing games with us. But I'm done talking. You've got one last chance to tell me what you're hiding, or this ends here. The old man didn't flinch. He simply straightened his shoulders, his gaze steady as he looked Rook in the eye. You don't want the truth, he said. Not really. Because if you did, you'd have to face what you've become. And that's the one thing you're most afraid of. The gang went silent. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy with implications they couldn't ignore. Rook's face twisted with anger, but there was something else beneath it, something the old man had struck deep within him. "You don't know anything about me," Rook hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what I've been through." The old man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Don't I?" he asked. "You think you're the only one who's suffered, the only one who's had to make impossible choices? I've been where you are, Rook. I know exactly what it's like to feel like the world's turned its back on you." For a moment, Rook said nothing. His breathing was heavy, his fists trembling at his sides. The other bikers watched him closely, their tension palpable. They had never seen their leader like this, uncertain, vulnerable. It was as if the old man had reached into a part of him they had never known existed. Finally, Rook let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the doubt creeping into his mind. "You're good," he said. "I'll give you that. You've got the whole wise old man act down to a science. But it's not gonna work on me." The old man's faint smile returned. "This isn't an act," he said. "This is reality. And whether you like it or not, it's catching up to you. Enough." Rook roared, his voice echoing through the street. He stepped closer to the old man, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a silver tongue and a few stories? Let me make one thing clear, you're nothing to me. And if you don't start talking, I'll make sure you regret ever opening your mouth." The old man met Rook's fiery gaze without blinking. He leaned on his cane, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You can try," he said simply. "But you'll only be proving me right." The tension in the air was suffocating. The bikers stood frozen, torn between their loyalty to Rook and the unease the old man's words had stirred within them. They had come here expecting an easy show of dominance, but instead, they were facing something far more complex, something they didn't fully understand. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a nervous energy about him, finally broke the silence. "Rook?" he said hesitantly, his voice barely audible. Maybe we should just let him go. He's just an old man. What's the point?" Rook whipped around, his glare silencing the wiry man instantly. "You don't get to make that call, Jace," he said coldly. "I'm the one in charge here." But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was spreading fast. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in Rook's leadership starting to waver. The old man saw it, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks widened. "Listen to your friend," the old man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "He's got more sense than the rest of you combined." Rook turned back to the old man, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled. "You think you can waltz in here and turn my own men against me? I don't need to turn them against you," the old man replied. "You're doing that all by yourself." The words hit Rook like a physical blow. He took a step back, his breathing ragged as he struggled to maintain his composure. The gang watched in silence, their unease growing with each passing moment. And then, the old man delivered the final blow. "I know what you're hiding," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "And I know why you're so desperate to keep it buried. But no secret stays hidden forever, Rook. Not even yours." Rook's eyes widened, his face pale as the weight of the old man's words settled over him. The bikers murmured among themselves, their voices a mixture of confusion and fear. They had never seen their leader like this, shaken, vulnerable, and on the verge of breaking. The old man took another step forward, his cane tapping against the pavement with a steady rhythm. "You can try to silence me," he said, "but it won't change the truth. And sooner or later, the truth has a way of coming out." The gang fell silent once more, their attention fixed on the old man. Even Rook, for all his bluster and bravado, seemed at a loss for words. The balance of power had shifted, and the old man now stood at the center of it all, a solitary figure holding the fate of the gang in his hands. "Now," the old man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded their attention. "Are you going to listen to me? Or are you going to keep pretending you're in control?" Rook's breath was shallow as he stared at the old man, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had faced rival gangs, backstabbers, and even the law without flinching, but something about this frail, aging figure standing before him was different. He felt exposed, as if the old man's steady gaze could peel back the layers of his carefully crafted persona and reveal the scared, uncertain man beneath. "What do you want from us?" Rook growled, his voice lower now, almost uncertain. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here and acting like you're holding all the cards." The old man tilted his head slightly, his calm expression never faltering. "I didn't come looking for you," he said. "You came to me. And now you're realizing that might have been a mistake." Tyler, the youngest member of the gang, couldn't contain his anxiety any longer. He stepped closer to Rook, lowering his voice as if trying to keep the others from hearing. "Boss, what's going on? Why is he talking like this? What does he know?" Rook snapped his head toward Tyler, his voice sharper than before. "I told you to shut your mouth," he hissed, though the tremor in his tone betrayed his mounting fear. "You're here to follow orders, not ask questions." But Tyler wasn't alone in his unease. The other bikers exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. They had followed Rook for years, trusting his strength and decisiveness. Now, for the first time, they were seeing cracks in his armor, and the old man was driving a wedge deeper with every passing second. "Enough of this," one of the bikers, Vince, grumbled, stepping forward with his arms crossed. He was older than most of the others, a seasoned member of the gang who had seen his fair share of fights. "This guy's just trying to mess with us. Let's stop wasting time and deal with him." "Go ahead," the old man said, his voice like ice. "If you think you're ready to face what comes next." Vince hesitated, his bravado faltering under the old man's piercing gaze. "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered, glancing at Rook for direction. But Rook said nothing. He was still staring at the old man, his mind racing as memories he had tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. The old man's face wasn't entirely unfamiliar, though he couldn't place where he had seen it before. But his words, the way he spoke with such certainty, such quiet power, made Rook feel as if he were standing on a precipice, teetering dangerously close to the edge. "You keep talking about the truth," Rook said finally, his voice rough. "So why don't you stop playing games and tell us what it is? What's this big secret you think you know?" The old man took a slow, measured breath, his eyes scanning the group before settling back on Rook. "You already know the truth," he said. "You've known it for a long time. You just don't want to face it." Rook's fists clenched at his sides, his frustration boiling over. "Enough with the riddles," he shouted. "Say what you have to say or I'll—" "You'll what?" the old man interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "Kill me? Beat me to a pulp? Go ahead. It won't change what you've done. It won't erase the past." The words landed like a slap to the face. Rook faltered, his anger giving way to something darker, something that had been festering inside him for years. He looked away, his jaw tight as he struggled to regain control. The other bikers watched in stunned silence, their confidence in their leader eroding with each passing moment. The old man stepped closer, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. "You're carrying a weight you can't bear," he said, his voice soft but unrelenting. "And you've spent your life trying to bury it under power, control, and fear. But deep down you know it's still there. And it always will be." Rook's head snapped back toward the old man, his eyes blazing. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he spat, though his voice wavered. "You're just some washed-up old fool trying to play mind games." "Maybe," the old man said with a faint smile. "But the way you're reacting tells me I've hit a nerve." The gang was unraveling. Tyler shuffled nervously on his feet, his eyes darting between Rook and the old man. Vince's scowl deepened, though he made no move to act. Even Jace, who had been loyal to Rook from the beginning, was starting to look uneasy. "What's he talking about, Rook?" Jace asked cautiously. "What's he trying to say?" Rook's gaze darted to Jace, his expression hardening. "Don't start, Jace," he warned. "You're better than this." But the old man seized the moment. "They deserve to know the truth," he said, his voice steady. "All of them. They've followed you blindly, believing in your strength, your leadership. But they don't know what you've done to get here." "Shut up," Rook snapped, his voice cracking with desperation. "Why don't you tell them?" the old man pressed, taking another step closer. "Or should I?" The bikers stared at Rook, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. The leader they had trusted for so long was crumbling before their eyes, and the old man was pulling the strings. "You're full of it," Rook growled, though his voice lacked conviction. "You don't know anything about me. You're just trying to turn my crew against me." The old man's faint smile disappeared, replaced by a look of cold determination. "I know everything about you," he said. "I know about the deals you made, the people you betrayed, the blood on your hands. And I know about the one person you failed to save." Rook froze. His breath hitched, his eyes widening as the old man's words pierced through him like a dagger. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something had shifted. "What's he talking about, boss?" Tyler asked quietly. "Who's he talking about?" Rook didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, fragments of memories flashing before his eyes. Memories he had tried so hard to forget. The old man's voice softened, though it lost none of its power. "You remember her, don't you?" he said. "The girl with the bright eyes and the innocent smile. The one who believed in you, even when no one else did." "Stop," Rook said, his voice barely audible. "She trusted you," the old man continued. "She thought you'd protect her. And when the time came, you failed her." "I said stop," Rook shouted, his voice cracking as he lashed out. He stepped forward, his fist raised as if to strike the old man, but he stopped himself at the last moment, his hand trembling in the air. The old man didn't flinch. He simply looked at Rook, his expression filled with quiet sadness. "You can't run from it, Rook," he said. "You've tried, but it's always there, lurking in the shadows. And no matter how hard you try to bury it, the truth always finds a way to surface." The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers stood frozen, their eyes locked on Rook as he struggled to contain the storm raging inside him. His shoulders slumped, his head dropping as the weight of the old man's words finally broke him. "You don't know what it's like," Rook said, his voice trembling. "You don't know what I had to do. The choices I had to make." "You're right," the old man said. "I don't know what it's like to be you. But I do know that carrying this guilt, this anger, it's killing you. And it's dragging everyone around you down with it." Rook's hands fell to his sides, his fists unclenching as he let out a shuddering breath. The bikers watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do or say. Their leader, the man they had followed through thick and thin, was unraveling before their eyes, and the old man was at the center of it all. "What do you want from me?" Rook asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's gaze softened, though his resolve never wavered. "I want you to stop running," he said. "Face the truth, Rook. It's the only way you'll ever be free." The gang remained in stunned silence, their leader's vulnerability cutting through the air like a blade. Rook, the man they had followed without question, looked smaller now. His fists hung limp by his sides, his head bowed as though the weight of the old man's words had physically crushed him. "You don't know what you're asking," Rook muttered, his voice hoarse. He lifted his gaze to meet the old man's piercing eyes, and for a brief moment, there was no anger, only a raw, unfiltered pain. "You don't understand what it's like to live with it." The old man didn't blink. His expression softened slightly, but his voice carried the same quiet authority that had disarmed Rook from the beginning. "You think you're the only one carrying a burden?" he asked. "You're not. We all have our ghosts. The question is, what are you going to do about yours?" The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their unease growing with every passing second. Tyler, his youthful bravado stripped away, spoke up again, his voice quivering. "What's he talking about, Rook? What happened?" Rook didn't answer. He turned away from the group, his broad shoulders rising and falling with every labored breath. For a moment, it looked as though he might walk away, but then he stopped, his hands clenching into fists once more. He turned back to the old man, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You don't get to come here and dig this up," Rook said, his voice trembling. "You don't get to talk about things you weren't there for." The old man took a step forward, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. "But I was there," he said quietly. "Not with you, not in that exact moment, but I've seen it. I've lived it. And I know what it feels like to carry the weight of a choice you can't undo." Rook's jaw tightened, his breathing heavy. "You think you know me?" he growled. "You don't know a damn thing." The old man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I know more than you think," he said. "And I know that running from it won't make it go away." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The bikers watched the exchange, their confusion and unease mounting with every word. Vince, always the pragmatist, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "Enough of this," he said gruffly. "If there's something we need to know, then let's hear it. Stop dancing around it and spit it out." The old man turned his gaze to Vince, his expression unreadable. "You want the truth?" he asked. "All right, I'll tell you." He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the group before settling back on Rook. "It was years ago," he began. "Before any of you knew Rook, back when he was still just a young man trying to prove himself. He was reckless, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to climb to the top. And for a while it worked. He made a name for himself, built a reputation as someone who didn't back down." Rook's face darkened, but he didn't interrupt. He stood frozen, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides as the old man's words dragged him back into memories he had spent years trying to bury. But then something happened, the old man continued, his voice steady. Something that changed everything. There was a girl, a young woman who trusted him, who believed in him. She thought he could protect her, that he could keep her safe from the life he was dragging her into. "Stop," Rook muttered, his voice barely audible. The old man ignored him. But when it mattered most, he couldn't. He made a choice, whether out of fear or selfishness or desperation, I don't know. But that choice cost her everything. "I said stop," Rook shouted, his voice cracking as he stepped forward. His fists trembled at his sides, his entire body tense with rage and anguish. "You don't get to talk about her. You don't get to say her name." The old man met Rook's glare without flinching. "Why not?" he asked softly. "Because it hurts? Because it reminds you of what you lost?" Rook's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He turned away, his back to the group as he let out a shaky breath. The bikers stared at him, their shock and confusion etched across their faces. They had seen their leader angry before, even vulnerable, but never like this. What happened to her?" Tyler asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rook didn't answer. He kept his back to the group, his head bowed as though he couldn't bear to face them. It was the old man who finally spoke. "She's gone," he said simply. "She trusted Rook, and it cost her everything." The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers stood frozen, their minds racing as they tried to piece together the fragments of the story. Jace, always the loyal one, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Rook," he said cautiously, "is that true? Is that what happened?" Rook let out a bitter laugh, his shoulders shaking with the effort of holding himself together. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice rough. He turned to face the group, his eyes red and glistening with unshed tears. "Fine. You want to know what happened? I screwed up. I let her down. And I've been paying for it ever since." The gang stared at him, their disbelief palpable. Rook had always been their rock, their unshakable leader. To see him like this, broken, vulnerable, was almost too much to comprehend. "What happened to her?" Vince asked, his voice steady but tinged with a rare softness. Rook hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "She was caught in the crossfire," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were trying to make a deal, trying to secure our place in the hierarchy. But it went sideways. The other guys turned on us, and she didn't make it." The old man watched Rook carefully, his expression unreadable. "And you've been running from it ever since," he said. "Hiding behind this gang, this image of strength, because you're too afraid to face the guilt?" Rook didn't respond. He turned away again, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his past was finally crushing him. The bikers remained silent, their eyes flicking between Rook and the old man as they tried to process what they had just heard. "Why are you telling us this?" Jace asked, his voice tinged with anger. "What's the point? To humiliate him? To make him feel worse than he already does?" The old man shook his head. "That's not why I'm here," he said. "I'm here because the truth has a way of coming out, whether you're ready for it or not. And if Rook doesn't face it now, it's going to destroy him, and all of you along with him." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty to Rook clashing with the undeniable truth of the old man's words. Tyler, always the first to speak his mind, stepped forward, his voice shaking. "So what do we do?" he asked. "Just pretend like none of this happened?" "No," the old man said firmly. "You don't pretend. You don't run. You face it together. Because that's the only way any of you are going to come out of this hole." Rook let out a harsh laugh, his voice filled with bitterness. "And what if I can't?" he asked, his back still turned to the group. "What if it's too late for me?" The old man stepped closer, his voice softening. "It's never too late," he said. "But it starts with you. You have to decide if you're willing to let go of the past, or if you're going to let it keep destroying you." Rook didn't respond. He stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists as he wrestled with the storm raging inside him. The bikers waited, their eyes fixed on their leader, as the old man's words hung in the air like a challenge. Rook stood motionless, his back to the gang, his fists trembling at his sides. The old man's words echoed in his mind, clawing at the fragile walls he'd built around his guilt. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was just that, past. But now, it was all crashing down, brought back to life by the relentless persistence of this stranger. The gang watched him, the tension palpable. Tyler, ever the impulsive one, stepped closer, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Boss, this isn't like you. We've always had your back. You've always had ours. But now," he hesitated, swallowing hard. "Now it feels like you're hiding something. And I think we deserve to know." Rook spun around, his eyes blazing. "You don't deserve anything," he snapped. "You think you know what it's like to lead? To make the calls that no one else wants to make? You don't know what I've done for this crew, what I've sacrificed." The bikers recoiled slightly at the venom in his tone, but none of them backed down. Vince, older and more level-headed than the others, crossed his arms and stepped forward. "We get it, Rook. You've done things we don't know about. But if you're telling us we're risking our necks every day for something you're too scared to admit, then maybe you're not the leader we thought you were." The words hit Rook like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to retaliate, but no words came out. He turned his glare to the old man, as though blaming him for this unraveling. "This is your fault," Rook growled. "You come here, spouting your cryptic garbage, and now you've got them doubting me." The old man didn't flinch. He leaned slightly on his cane, his expression calm and steady. "I didn't make them doubt you, Rook," he said. "You did that all on your own. All I did was shine a light on the cracks you've been trying to hide." "Shut up," Rook roared, his voice reverberating down the empty street. His chest heaved as he took a step closer to the old man, his hands shaking with barely restrained rage. "You don't get to come here and tear everything apart. You don't know what I've built, what I've lost." "I know what you're trying to protect," the old man said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "But this isn't about your crew, Rook. It's about her. It's always been about her." Rook froze. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He turned away again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the old man's words. Tyler stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "Who is she, Rook? Who's this girl he's talking about?" Rook didn't answer. His head dropped lower, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The old man let out a soft sigh, his gaze fixed on the broken man before him. "Her name was Sarah," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of a story long buried. "She was young, full of life. She didn't belong in this world, but she followed Rook anyway. She trusted him." The gang shifted uneasily, their confusion turning to quiet dread as the old man's story unfolded. Vince's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. "What happened to her?" The old man's eyes flicked back to Rook. "Tell them," he said softly. "They deserve to hear it from you." Rook didn't move. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he turned to face the gang, his expression hollow. "It was my fault," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were trying to make a deal with a rival crew. They wanted to show strength, to prove we couldn't just walk in and take what we wanted." He paused, his throat tightening as he forced himself to continue. "She shouldn't have been there. I told her to stay back, but she wouldn't listen. She said she didn't trust them, that she wanted to make sure I was safe. His voice cracked, and he looked away, unable to meet their eyes. When the shooting started, she got caught in the crossfire. The gang stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tyler's voice trembled as he asked, She died? Rook nodded, his hands clenching into fists. I tried to save her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But it was too late. She was gone before I could do anything. The old man watched him in silence, his expression unreadable. The bikers shifted uneasily, the weight of Rook's confession settling over them like a dark cloud. Vince shook his head, his voice low and rough. And you never told us? After all these years, you never said a damn thing? What good would it have done? Rook snapped, his voice rising again. You think telling you would have brought her back? Would it have changed anything? It would have shown us who you really are, Vince shot back. Instead, you've been hiding behind this tough guy act, pretending like nothing can touch you. Rook let out a bitter laugh. You think I wanted to be this way? You think I like carrying this around every damn day? I didn't have a choice. The old man stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. You always have a choice, he said. You just didn't want to face the consequences of yours. Rook's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't respond. He turned away, running a hand through his hair as he tried to calm the storm raging inside him. The gang watched him in silence, their loyalty to their leader shaken but not yet broken. Tyler stepped closer, his voice hesitant. Boss, we've all made mistakes. We've all done things we're not proud of. But you've always told us to own it, to face it head on. Why can't you do the same? Rook turned to look at him, his expression softening slightly. Because facing it means admitting I failed her, he said. It means admitting that everything I've done since then has been a lie. The old man took another step forward, his voice firm but kind. It's not too late to make it right, he said. But you have to be willing to let go of the guilt, the anger. You have to stop running. Rook shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know how. You start by telling the truth, the old man said. Not just to them, but to yourself. You've spent so long trying to bury this, but it's time to let it out. It's the only way you'll ever find peace. The silence that followed was deafening. Rook stood frozen, his eyes locked on the old man as he wrestled with the weight of his words. The bikers watched him, their loyalty hanging in the balance as they waited for their leader to make his choice. Finally, Rook let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned to face the gang, his expression weary but determined. You're right, he said. All of you. I've been hiding this for too long. And it's time I stopped. The old man nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. Good, he said. That's the first step. The gang exchanged uncertain glances, their loyalty to Rook tempered by the vulnerability he had just shown. Vince stepped forward, his expression serious. We've got your back, Rook, he said. But if we're going to follow you, we need to know we can trust you. No more secrets? Rook nodded, his jaw tightening. No more secrets, he said. I swear. The old man stepped back, his job done. It's up to you now, he said. What happens next is your choice. Rook watched him go, his mind racing with the weight of his confession and the road ahead. The gang fell silent, their tension giving way to a tentative sense of unity. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, they felt like they were on the same page. And for the first time, Rook felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Rook stood there in the growing silence, the weight of his admission pressing on his chest like an immovable boulder. He looked at the gang, his brothers, his family, and saw their faces etched with disbelief, hurt, and perhaps even betrayal. Vince's steady gaze cut into him like a knife. Tyler looked like he was on the verge of tears, a young man suddenly forced to confront the fragility of his leader. Jace shifted nervously, as though unsure whether to step forward and console Rook or turn away altogether. The old man hadn't moved. He leaned lightly on his cane, watching them all with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this all before. His presence was still commanding, like an unspoken authority in the room, even if he said nothing. Is this it, then? Rook asked, his voice bitter as he finally broke the silence. Is this the part where you all turn on me? Tyler stepped forward hesitantly, his voice trembling. Boss, no one's turning on you. We didn't know. We didn't know any of this. And what would you have done if you had? Rook's tone was sharp, defensive. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Would you have been able to look at me the same? Would you have followed me into those fights, knowing I couldn't even save the person who mattered most to me? Vince crossed his arms over his chest, his voice steady but firm. We followed you because we believed in you, Rook. Because you gave us something to fight for. But now, he shook his head, his words heavy with disappointment. I don't even know what we've been fighting for all this time. Rook's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped short. He didn't have an answer. For years, he had convinced himself that the gang was his purpose, his reason for pushing forward. But now, standing under the unflinching gaze of the old man, he realized how hollow that purpose had become. It was never about the gang, the old man said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Not really. You built this because you were trying to outrun your guilt. You thought if you kept moving, kept fighting, you wouldn't have to stop and face the truth. Rook turned to him, his eyes blazing. What do you know about it? He demanded. What do you know about what I've been through? The old man took a slow step forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. I know more than you think, he said. I know what it's like to carry the weight of someone's death. To wake up every day and wonder if you could have done something, anything, to change the outcome. And I know what it's like to let that guilt eat away at you until there's nothing left. The gang shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Rook and the old man. Vince cleared his throat, his tone laced with suspicion. And how exactly do you know all this? Who are you really? The old man's gaze shifted to Vince, his expression calm but resolute. Who I am doesn't matter, he said. What matters is that I've been where you are. I've stood in the same place Rook is standing now, faced with the same choice. And I know how easy it is to make the wrong one. Tyler frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. What choice? He asked. What are you talking about? The old man turned his attention back to Rook, his eyes piercing. The choice to let this define you, he said. To let your pain and your guilt turn you into something you're not. Or to face it head on and finally let it go. Let it go? Rook's voice cracked as he barked out a laugh. You say that like it's so easy. Like I can just wake up one day and decide I'm fine. It doesn't work like that. No, it doesn't, the old man agreed. It's not easy and it's not quick. But it starts with taking the first step. And that step is accepting the truth. Rook shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. And what happens after that, huh? What do I do once I've accepted it? What's left for me then? The old man's expression softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of empathy in his voice. You rebuild, he said simply. You start over. Not for her and not for anyone else, but for yourself. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on everyone. Rook stared at the ground, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For years, he had buried himself in the gang, using it as a shield to protect himself from his own emotions. The thought of facing the truth, of tearing down the walls he had built, was terrifying. But as he stood there, surrounded by the gang he had built and the old man who seemed to know him better than he knew himself, he realized he didn't have a choice. Not anymore. I don't know if I can do it, Rook admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You can, the old man said firmly. You just have to decide that you want to. Rook looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Why are you doing this? He asked. Why do you care what happens to me? The old man hesitated, his grip tightening on his cane. For a moment, it looked as though he might not answer. But then he sighed, his voice softening. Because I've seen what happens when someone takes the wrong path, he said. I've seen what it does to them, to the people around them. And I don't want to see it happen to you. The gang exchanged uncertain glances, their loyalty to Rook tempered by the old man's quiet conviction. Tyler stepped forward, his voice hesitant but earnest. Boss, if you want to try, we're with you. We've always been with you. Jace nodded, his voice steady. You're not in this alone, Rook. Whatever you decide, we'll back you up. Even Vince, who had been the most critical, gave a reluctant nod. But you've got to be honest with us, he said. No more lies. No more hiding. Rook looked at them, his gang, his family, and felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. He turned to the old man, his voice trembling. "Where do I even start?" The old man smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through his stoic exterior. "Start by taking it one day at a time," he said. "And remember, you're not as alone as you think." Rook nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. The gang closed in around him, their presence a quiet reassurance that, despite everything, they were still with him. The old man watched them for a moment longer before turning to leave, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. As he walked away, Rook called out to him, his voice hesitant. "Wait." The old man stopped but didn't turn around. "What is it?" he asked. "Who are you?" Rook asked, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity. "Why does it feel like you know me better than I know myself?" The old man hesitated, his grip tightening on his cane. Finally, he turned back, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I've been in your shoes before," he said. "And someone helped me find my way back. I'm just paying it forward." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Rook and the gang standing in the street. For a long moment, none of them spoke. But the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was different, filled with a quiet sense of possibility. Rook let out a shaky breath, his voice steady for the first time in hours. "All right," he said. "Let's get out of here." The gang nodded, their trust in him restored, and together, they walked into the night. For the first time in years, Rook felt like he was finally taking a step in the right direction. And somewhere in the distance, the old man smiled.